Darian,
Yeah, Aaron?
I gotta tell you something.
What's up?
I think I've caught a bad case of the blues.
The blues.
Yeah, the podcast blues.
Bottom.
The podcast blues ain't no fun, folks, I tell you what. Well, Darian, let me tell you,
Bum.
I don't do this for the views.
Bum.
This show doesn't make any money.
Bum.
I do this for the blues.
Bottom.
Oh, I got them podcast blues. And ain't no fun.
Bottom.
I'm sitting here in the basement,
Bum.
and I don't have any time to lose.
Bum.
I just hope by the time this song is done,
Bum.
the audience hasn't started to snooze.
Bum.
Oh, please take away these podcast blues. Bum, 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 bow, bow. Hello, everyone. Welcome again to another exciting episode of Side Stories. As always, I'm Aaron.
And I'm Darian, I believe.
I hope you enjoyed our wonderful special intro for this bluesy episode today.
Yeah, if you couldn't tell from our intro, we are going to be talking about the blues today.
Yes, the good old-fashioned, deep-down, roots in the South Delta blues. And specifically, you're going to talk about a few blues artists from that area as well. We're talking about 1930s, 1920s as well. So getting some ritzy stuff in.
Yeah, and if you are a human being who likes music, which is probably everyone, it's really hard to talk about American music specifically without at least talking about the blues in some way, shape, or form, because pretty much every form of modern American music takes inspiration from or has its roots in blues music.
Yeah, some way, shape, or form, the music you listen to is probably inspired by the blues. There might be a few outliers out there, but, I mean, even things like electronic music, which you think would be, a million miles away from the blues, it can have roots in the blues as well, depending on who you're listening to. So everything is connected in some way, shape, or form when it comes to American music.
Yeah, so if you really want to understand where American music comes from and how it developed to where it's at today in the 21st century, you really can't get past having a deep understanding of how blues developed as a very distinct genre.
And Darian, why don't you tell us how that happened?
Yeah, so blues ultimately comes from African American slave music. Slaves were brought over from Africa to the Americas starting as early as the 1600s, and they were put on plantations largely in the South as well as in the Caribbean to basically farm crops, especially cotton and tobacco in the American South. And they were very restricted in the types of things that they could do. A lot of their original culture back from Africa was intentionally suppressed to keep the slaves docile. But one of the things that they were allowed to do while they were working was sing, because as anyone in the military would tell you, singing songs does not only does it increase productivity, but it also increases morale, and it can take a person's mind off of tasks that are often incredibly tedious and boring.
It also creates a sense of community as well.
Yes,
which
it
is vitally important.
creates a sense of community, which was probably an unintended consequence from the perspective of the slave owners, but it was definitely very intentional for the slaves themselves. I mean, if you're working in the hot southern sun doing really backbreaking, menial, repetitive work, literally being a slave, singing would be one of the few consistent joys you would have in your life, and you would definitely use singing as one of the few things you can do to really bond and feel a sense of community with your fellow slaves.
And another thing that's important to remember about a lot of these slave songs, that they were deeply spiritual in a lot of ways, and depending on what era and place you're talking about, these songs could involve spirituality in a few different ways. Later generations of slaves were much more Christian, as they've been more Christianized over time, whereas the older slaves tended to hold on to their beliefs from Africa a little bit more. Again, it depends on where you were talking about there, but as conversion continued throughout slave populations, the music started to take on more and more Christian references. Sometimes these were to hide African spiritual references, sometimes they were sincere Christian belief. Again, it depends on where we're at. And as these spiritual references started to make their way into the music, there was a reaction from the slave-owning population. When they heard that, they started to think that these references, if they caught them, were often very demonic or satanic in nature, which usually was not the case, but that started to make a connection between these slave songs and, heathen or pagan gods, which eventually stuck in a sense, into blues music, as blues eventually became known as the devil's music, though blues also does include a lot of Christian references, as slave songs did as well. So you're seeing a trend of like supernatural belief making its way into the music, which of course goes back into, you know, the dawn of time. Music has always been intertwined with religion, but the specific supernatural references of either being heathen or Christian are deeply rooted in the blues as well as they were rooted in the slave songs. And it's interesting you mentioned the slave communities, because you're also going to get this thing called juke joints, which are a very big community oriented, or I guess like a music hall, or if you've been to like a legitimate honky tonk bar sort of place, think of like that.
That's probably the closest
but
modern example.
even less money for upkeep and probably more people. So even crazier than your average honky tonk from back in the day. It's going to be like that. So you're going to have a lot of these places where people are playing blues music, and those are going to be called places of vice and sin, which is also going to throw in more of these dark kind of demonic references, and blues is again going to be associated with this sort of negative spiritual, you know, characteristics.
Even the word juke itself, I don't remember what exactly it means, but it means something along the lines of like sin or garbage, or just the word itself has an extremely negative connotation.
So as you can see, the blues inherited a lot from slave songs. Again, you got the spirituality, you got the sense of community, you know, changing from, you know, slave songs into blues music. But there's one thing that's interesting to contrast between blues and slave songs, is that the bluesman lifestyle was very different from the average, you know, life that a slave would have lived, which is very immobile in that they couldn't leave their plantations and have any sense of freedom for the most part. While a bluesman was often known as a traveled on his feet, got everywhere, went all over the country. You know, you'd play every backwater town in the South, basically taking your music from juke joint to juke joint, trying to play any show at all, every street corner. That was very different than the average slave lifestyle. A lot of these guys would just carry like a guitar on their back or whatever instrument they played, and they would take it from town to town with, you know, tiny places, probably on city street corners if they ever got to any of the larger metropolitan areas, and they would just play wherever. And that was a very, very different lifestyle. So those are the three big things that when I think about, you know, like African slave songs and getting to the blues itself, those are the things that both changed and were also carried over into the blues as a genre.
One thing about the blues I think is important to understand is that, especially at this time, the blues was very much a working class genre of music. It was like the low class music. No self-respecting individual, black or white, would try to make a living playing blues.
Or at least that's what society said.
At least that's what society said, and a lot of people in the black community at the time agreed. So I think that really contextualizes a lot of what you were talking about. One, with the demonization, that you have people who are higher up in society looking down on this very working class genre of music, and even when they attempted to incorporate Christian or religious elements, they were seen as, I don't know what you call it,
heathen or not true believers, or, you know,
not sincere.
Yeah,
at best. And
yeah, at best.
And then also with these, as you said, the bluesmen lifestyle, you know, these, at least initially, these people were not well off. You don't typically start in a good position socioeconomically and decide to travel around singing the blues. You are basically on the bottom rung of society, and you essentially have the freedom to take on the sort of lifestyle and just live life for all it's worth.
So when it comes to bluesmen, this might sound a little familiar to you as the pieces are getting put together. So they're traveling men, often living, you know, hard music playing lifestyles, going from town to town, playing wherever they can. Got a lot of spiritual energy to them and a lot of rebellion in them.
Sounds pretty metal to me.
Sounds a little metal, sounds a little rock and roll to me, and that's exactly what became, well, not became, but the blues heavily influenced those genres immensely. So we owe a lot to the blues of our modern musical tastes as well, and there's a lot of that blues DNA in, again, like we said, everything you listen to. One thing that is a little bit less talked about, because we've talked a lot about the history of the actual music here, there's also a lot of blues legends that inspired the actual, I guess, aesthetics or themes you find in rock and roll and heavy metal music and all that going forward, and you can't get any more important than the first true satanic panic in American history, which was the panic over the devil's influence on blues music. Now, part of this was, I guess, well, it's a very dense subject here, so I'm going to try my best to explain it in the time that we do have. But one thing you have to remember is that typically juke joints, again, that we talked about earlier, the places where people are actually going listening to the blues, which are often little more than cabins kind of on the outskirts of small towns where people just meet every day to go play some, for lack of a better term, hard rock and blues. These juke joints often became known as areas of sin and vice, and they were also seen as being in direct competition for lack of a better term, souls with churches. And so pastors were often denouncing juke joints as places of sin and vice and misery, which, to be fair, sometimes they could be. Sometimes they weren't. Depends on your area. Depends on the juke joint. Though, of course, it also didn't stop some pastors from becoming blues musicians themselves. In fact, Son House, who was someone that had a large amount of influence on blues music and played at a large number of juke joints, was himself a pastor. So there is some overlap between the two, but there is a bit of spiritual warfare going on for the hearts and minds of the American people here in the Deep South. So that's part of the start of the story. And of course, those old slave song references that we mentioned, where people could reference, African music or, demons or devils and all of that, that got brought into the blues as well. And of course, when you start singing about that in a juke joint, a lot of people start to take you perhaps a little bit too literally, and they start to think that maybe you're a little bit into the dark side of things. So that also started as well, which became this sort of moral panic in the United States as soon as blues started becoming an actual popular genre. Once it couldn't be just considered this low down thing for random miscreants who went from town to town, it started to become a true national phenomenon. And as soon as that started to happen, then you start to see a lot of controversy coming into the genre as well. And that starts the first true satanic panic in American history. And some people, thinking they can make a quick buck off of this because controversy always sells, decide to directly attach themselves to that. And I believe the first person to ever do this, as far as I'm aware, is a man by the name of Petey Wheatstraw, who, well, that was his stage name, but I'll be just calling him that so that you can, follow along with the story easier. Petey Wheatstraw was a blues musician. He mostly played piano, but seeing that there was a lot of controversy going on in, blues communities and America as a whole over the supposed connections between, heathen or pagan or satanic influences in blues music, decide to essentially just, make it a marketing scheme. And he dubbed himself the High Sheriff of Hell, or more famously, the Devil's Son-in-Law. And so when he sold his albums, it would be by Petey Wheatstraw, the Devil's Son-in-Law. And of course, his album started to sell a lot more as soon as that happens. Why? Who knows? It's the kind of thing where either people are curious or because people are talking about you more, that, for that sheer fact alone, you start to sell more records because now you're in the news.
Or they're just so shocked and disgusted that they can't help themselves, but
you have to hear it, right?
Yeah, you have to. It's like you can't look away from a car crash.
Exactly. And Petey Wheatstraw actually recorded, I think it was over 160 vinyl record sides. So I think that's roughly 4 to 5 songs for each side. So, you do the math. Again, that depends on how many takes he did too, but he recorded a lot, and he had a long career spanning from the 1920s to, I think, the early 1940s when he died in a car crash, which actually made national news because he was still near the height of his popularity when he died. So that was a huge thing for somebody to attach themselves to the satanic panic sort of thing and just, for lack of a better term, own it, despite I don't believe he had any actual beliefs in the occult or black magic or anything like that as far as I know. But he thought that, hey, if people are going to call me the devil's, a friend of the devil, I might as well really, make it part of my shtick, and it worked. Also, again, dying in a car crash at a young age, making national news, and also rustling up a bunch of controversy. Very rock and roll of you, Petey. Though Petey Wheatstraw might have been the first person to attach himself to this sort of demonic influence in music, again, mostly for stage theatrics, he is not the most famous person to do it, though the man I'm going to talk about may or may not have done it intentionally. There's still a lot of hot controversy over it, and I think you know who that is, Darren, because we're talking next about Robert Johnson, perhaps the most famous blues man of his era, despite not being well known in his time. But after many, many decades, he's become the one person that many people can name from this time period. Now, when we're talking about Robert Johnson, the big thing that people know about him is his legend. I just want to preface this that we don't know a ton about Robert Johnson as a person. We've figured out a pretty decent amount as time has gone on. There's been a lot of interest in him, but the big thing that everyone knows is his legend. And I'm going to talk about that first because it's the thing that people know, but I want to peel back the story and get to the heart of who he was as a person, at least to the best of my ability, after I talk about the legend here. So just a quick disclaimer. There's a lot of myth-making about him. He's maybe the most romanticized musician in American history. At least he's up there. So I just want to preface this real quick before I start. But the story goes that there was a young man by the name of Robert Johnson living in the South. And he hung out around a lot of juke joints, and he liked to play harmonica. He was decently good at that, but he really wanted to play guitar. Thing was, he was not good at it at all. In fact, he stunk out the place almost every time he picked up a guitar. This is directly from Son House, who I mentioned earlier, one of the famous blues musicians. He saw Robert Johnson play multiple times, and he was not very good, at least in his younger days. Then Robert went missing for a while. Usually it's the timeline's given about 6 months, where no one saw him. Then one day he mysteriously came back, and all of a sudden he could play amazingly well. Son House describes it as he was expecting everybody to, make fun of Robert again, or Robert's going to stink out the place, but then he said, and I quote, "All of our mouths were standing open," unquote, as Johnson finished his set, because all of a sudden he could play guitar with the best of them. He was the best that anyone at the juke joint had ever heard. And the story goes that Johnson's abilities mysteriously came about when he went to a crossroads late at night, right around midnight, big full moon in the air, creepy wind blowing, and he's just trying to get better at playing guitar. And all of a sudden, a mysterious, large, shadowy man comes out of nowhere and tunes Johnson's guitar for him, plays a few chords, hands it back to him. All of a sudden, Johnson can play with the best of them, just like that. And supposedly what's happening here is that Johnson has just sold his soul to the devil in a Faustian bargain to get his amazing talents. And that's how the story goes, and that's become integrated with the DNA of rock and roll and heavy metal and everything else. That story goes back, into almost all popular music that deals with anything supernatural. But it's also been heavily romanticized, so we're going to try to hit at what the actual truth is here. So Robert Johnson himself was born as the illegitimate son of a sharecropper, and I believe he was the 10th child that his mother had had.
It's the 11th, actually.
The 11th. So, yeah. He was from a very big family, and of course, an illegitimate son, 11th child, already a good start for a bluesman's life.
And as probably an unneeded side note, he wasn't the 11th illegitimate son of his mother. He was the one and only illegitimate child that she had.
Thank you for clearing that up, Darian. Just to clarify that. But Johnson, of course, wasn't obviously into sharecropping. Didn't want to do that. Was much more interested in music, though, of course, when he first started out, he was not very good. Now, I understand that a lot of people want to believe the legend that he sold his soul to the devil, and that's how he got his talent. But I'll be honest, the more likely way that he got his talent was through hard work and determination, because he met an old bluesman by the name of Ike Zimmerman. Now, they did practice in a very odd way, because Zimmerman tutored Johnson in a graveyard of all places, apparently because it was, and I quote, quiet. Which is a good enough reason to practice in a graveyard.
Graveyards are typically quite quiet.
Typically, I'd be very worried about a noisy graveyard. So, in fact, that little tidbit about his life may have helped inspire the story of him selling his soul to the devil. It's hard to pinpoint. Again, the myth about Robert Johnson's life is hard to, again, trace the origins of. There's a few different candidates here, but Johnson did become a very accomplished blues musician, and he did record a few songs in Texas. He recorded, I believe, 29 songs total, and that's all we have of his recorded material. Otherwise, he was just a traveling musician. And in his lifetime, he did not reach like any sort of true popularity, though he always dreamed of it. That's something he was always really, for lack of a better term, hell-bent on, was becoming a popular blues artist. That's what he always wanted to do in his life. That's what he almost constantly talked about for people who knew him. That's all he talked about, was just his success in life.
And actually, supposedly, the day that he died, and it's speculated that he was murdered by the husband of a woman that he performed for in a juke joint. The husband wasn't very happy with the type of attention he was giving his wife, so he offed him. But supposedly, the same day that he was murdered, he received a letter from a man who was organizing an event at Carnegie Hall and wanted Johnson to perform there. And very likely, had that happened, that would have just made Johnson's career take off, and he probably would have achieved lifetime fame and notoriety.
Yes, so you're also seeing, this is the part where the legend and his real life blur, because yes, you're right, he was He did die underneath mysterious circumstances. Some people speculate he was actually murdered. There's also speculation that it was an accident or he died of something else, because on his official death record, his death is listed as syphilis, though there is an argument to me that that was to cover up foul play. Now, at juke joints, I forget the name of the chemical. Basically, there was a sort of drug or chemical that was sometimes put into drinks to simmer people down, and it's possible that Johnson
Alcohol?
was... No, like something you put into like whiskey and stuff like that to actually get people to kind of, it's like a sort of a sedative.
Oh.
And I can't remember which specifically it was, but apparently at the time that was something, if someone was being too rowdy at a juke joint, you would put a little bit of that in their drink and that would get them to kind of chill. Now, it's
Try
possible
doing that in a bar today.
Yeah, no, that wouldn't fly at all. Again, that just shows how rowdy this place has got, that they need to have illicit substances to put in your already illicit substance, because it's the late 20s and early 30s, which is prohibition, so you can't be drinking anyways. So yeah, there's these places were crazy. But it's possible that was put in his drink and it accidentally poisoned him, because he was just diagnosed with an ulcer, and that might have helped, put him in the ground. But it's also possible that was a lethal amount was put in to poison him. It's hard to say, probably impossible to truly know, but there's speculation by real historians both ways. And the thing about Carnegie Hall is that did happen, but Johnson actually never heard about it. He had died right before the letter got to him. So he didn't get the letter during his lifetime, but it was on its way, or basically people were going to tell him that he was supposed to perform at Carnegie Hall, which was going to be his big break.
Yeah, based on what I understand, that fact may have been bent a little bit by the organizer himself to make it a little more poetic. And also that whole circumstance also plays into the idea that he might have sold his soul to the devil, in the sense that, like, he came to the devil saying that he wanted to be the best blues musician in the world. And if he were to have performed at Carnegie Hall, he probably would have become the best blues musician in the world. So in that sense, his agreement with the devil was up, and the devil came back to collect his soul.
Yeah, that's also part of the legend itself. Now, of course, again, you're seeing a lot of interplay between legend and actual reality here. And the thing is that Johnson might have perpetuated the myth of him selling his soul, himself. He might have come up with that. Or it's possible that he actually took it from another blues musician that he met by the name of Tommy Johnson. No relation, by the way. Now, Tommy Johnson, for a long time, had been saying that he sold his soul to the devil to become a great blues musician. That was something that he had come up with. Though the lineage of that story is also very hard to track as well. Tommy actually had such a bad alcohol addiction, he would drink basically rubbing alcohol from shoe polish and stuff like that. It became so bad in his life.
Ew.
So yeah, he had a lot of major issues. That eventually did him in, and he died basically slowly slipping away as an alcoholic later in life. So he had a very tragic life as well. But that story might have been something that Robert Johnson lifted from Tommy Johnson and brought onto his own legend. Or it might have been connected later on after Robert's death. It's hard to say. But what we do know is that Son House later became a relatively well-known blues musician in his own right. And there was this thing that happened in the 50s and 60s in Europe where it was the blues boom. This became a huge, huge, huge thing that eventually inspired a lot of rock and roll artists. And Son House toured across Europe in the 50s and 60s. And what he would often do to, wow the audience or, make them feel mystified is he would tell the legend of Robert Johnson, who was this great blues musician that, supposedly sold his soul to the devil and, was later poisoned in life, right before he was supposed to become a big legend and all that sort of thing. So it might be that Son House invented the story as well. It's hard to say. Things are iffy, but basically that is how it got into the popular consciousness, was through Son House, who might have actually mixed the stories of Robert Johnson and Tommy Johnson up, which could be on purpose or by mistake. It's almost impossible to know.
And it could also be that the legends around both Tommy and Robert Johnson come from an earlier origin, and they both just, for one reason or another, happen to both have those legends surrounding them, but they're really based off of some earlier figure.
Yeah, and again, as I mentioned of Petey Wheatstraw earlier, there are people that were already intentionally mixing these things together to be part of their marketing and their persona and trying to, make themselves stand out in the music world. So it's possible that, Johnson was certainly, Robert Johnson was certainly a fan of Petey Wheatstraw. He was also, I should mention this, he was also a fan of multiple white artists like Gene Autry and other people as well. He really loved those people. So he was taking from a lot of different artists of his time. And that's probably part of why he was so good, is he took from pretty much everybody. And he also developed his own unique style, which again, he learned in the graveyard, extra spooky. And he also had a very soulful voice, and he played in a very unique way. So that's what made him such an important artist. He also died at the age of 27, which, if you know anything about music kind of folklore, the 27 Club is when a lot of great artists have passed away. You know, Kurt Cobain, Amy Winehouse, Jim Morrison, Hendrix, Janis Joplin, all died at 27. That's just the ones I can remember off the top of my head. Brian Jones from the Rolling Stones as well. It's a very big club, and Robert Johnson would be in there as well. So that, of course, adds more fuel to the fire, too, and all the rampant, crazy speculation. Basically, Robert Johnson's life, we know just enough about it to have concrete facts, but we also know just not enough about it to where we can add in a lot of, like, fun folklore and legends onto it. So that's part of the reason why I would say that he became such a myth in the blues community, because there's just enough out there of his recorded music to, like, really enjoy and sink your teeth into. Plus, he also did sing about, like, he had a song called, like, Hellhound on My Trail and, like, Crossroad Blues and things that are just... They don't explicitly say anything about his legend per se, but it's just a little bit spooky. It's just a little bit out there, and there's just not enough information about it.
And it's also just persistent enough to make you think that maybe, maybe it's true. Maybe he did actually sell his soul to the devil. I mean, he's singing about it. In reality, he didn't sing about it as much as I think some people make it out to be.
Yeah, and he never, as far as I know, explicitly said, I sold my soul or anything like that. But he talks about run-ins with the devil and strange kind of spiritual things. And again, it's only about 3 or 4 of his songs where he really hits at it. But he only recorded about, again, like 29 songs. There's not much there, so...
And also, as we've touched on earlier, there was precedent for including those sorts of elements in blues music.
Exactly, and those end up being some of his most popular songs, or at least the ones that people really latched onto. So that drives the speculation even more, because all of these, there's a lot of interplay in between all of these different elements in the old blues communities. And that's how the legend persisted on to this day.
So, if you'll allow me, I want to go on a little bit of a tangent, because as I was doing research for this episode, I didn't really know a whole lot about Robert Johnson. But I read his story, or his legend, if that's how you want to call it. And I noticed that this idea of him going to a crossroads to meet with the devil kept popping up over and over, and people were always hitting home on the idea that he went to a crossroads. Now, don't ask me where this comes from. It's just one of the weird tidbits of information that I happen to know. But I know a little bit about, like, European witchcraft and the occult, and the idea of a crossroads actually comes up quite a bit, and especially with magic and witchcraft, I think is a really interesting connection. So historically, witches and witchcraft has been associated with the devil. The idea being that witches get their power from the devil, and they've also been associated with the Greek goddess Hecate. She was the goddess of magic, but she also happened to be the goddess of crossroads. The idea behind that was the Greeks and the Romans put a lot of significance on crossroads themselves, because they're a place where two roads intersect. They're typically where a lot of journeys are commenced, and so they were given religious significance, and a lot of I don't want to say spells, but rituals were performed at crossroads for to protect travelers if they were going on a long journey. So the goddess Hecate was given special attention in that regard.
So they had a spiritual, superstitious significance.
Yes, they did. And also the Greek god Hermes was also associated with travel, so he also had an element there. Now you have the connection between witches and Hecate and the devil as well by extension. You also have Hermes, who is is a major figure in the Hermetic movement of the Middle Ages, which has a really interesting interplay between actual scholarship, but also magic and witchcraft. Is sort of like this underground academic or quasi-academic movement in the Middle Ages, which just sort of bubbles up everywhere and is interesting in and of itself. But yeah, you have witches who do have who do place a significance on crossroads in, I guess you call it, witch theology for back of the letter.
Witchcraft occultism.
Yeah, the idea behind a crossroads is that it's a place. It's a liminal space. It's a place where change occurs. It's a coming together of two different things. It's a threshold. And so there's a lot of significance placed on that. It's believed that crossroads have a lot of magical power in that sense. And the whole idea behind witchcraft and casting a spell is asserting your will on the physical world to enact change. So you have this connection between crossroads and casting spells. Then, as I mentioned earlier, witches are supposed to get their power from the devil, so you have this connection between the devil and crossroads as well. And it seems interesting that whole idea was already in Europe at the time, and probably also came over to America as well. You actually see a lot of crossroad deities both in pagan European religions, but also African religions as well, that I would suppose got intermixed in the American South and in the Caribbean. It's especially in voodoo, there is lots of crossroad magic, and I would suspect that it's probably not common knowledge, but it would have been an idea that may have been thrown around in the deep American South at the time that may have inspired a lot of these myths and legends about.
Absolutely. Voodoo was a big influence on a lot of slave songs, or at least, African spirituality, especially in the Americas and the Caribbean. So it's certainly possible, which I'm glad you brought it up, because that's kind of I know you said it was a tangent, but I like how you wrap that back into everything we were talking about here.
I got to make it at least somewhat relevant.
Yeah, no, it's cool because, again, all these ideas, they can all interconnect. You can have ideas that go back literally thousands of years, influencing our modern music even now. And of course, this might be a bit more obvious for a spiritual connection, but a cross is a religious symbol.
Mm-hmm.
It's a Christian symbol. And of course, if you're meeting the devil at a crossroads, that could be seen as a heathen act or, some sort of, affront to God as well. And it could also be perhaps a cry for help as well, of like, oh, I'm stuck at a crossroads, God save me from this thing that's come my way as well. So
I don't think it's surprising at all that so many cultures have placed explicit religious significance on crossroads. They're very
it's not a coincidence.
Yeah, they're important physically, but they're also just the idea behind them is very symbolic and powerful. And also, this is something I forgot to mention earlier, but crossroads were common meeting places for witches because they were always outside of town, so they were quote unquote safe space to cast spells and practice witchcraft.
Yeah, so it's a significant place. People are going to know where it is, but it's away from everybody else.
Yes, exactly.
Which is so again, if you're going to do creepy things out in the middle of nowhere, it's a quote unquote
that's
good
how
place
they would get this weird satanic
kind of underhanded,
underhanded heathenistic reputation.
Again, thank you for that, Darren. I wish I had more to build off of there, but you kind of said everything you need to. I guess the last thing we just need to cover is kind of how the legacy of Robert Johnson's legend and the blues also influenced rock and roll and heavy metal, because that will be our next episode for next week, by the way.
This is part 1 of a 2-part series.
I mean, they're 2 standalone episodes, but they're kind of part of just the overall saga, because we're going to be talking a little bit about the supernatural and heavy metal next time, too. But you can take these as more of a... If I wrote a book on this subject, the next one is the other book on a different subject that I wrote.
Yeah,
if that makes more sense. So not really a part 1, a part 2, but you can listen to both. Please
really, if you want to get a little meta, we were going to just record this as one episode, specifically focusing on the history of heavy metal. But we quickly realized
there's a lot to blues as well, and that you have to tell this story before you tell the other one.
Absolutely.
So, all right, we're going to end strong here. So, Robert Johnson, again, he dies in complete obscurity for the most part. He does have a little bit of a bubbling under reputation. He's known in the region as an important bluesman, but he dies, and his legend's kind of lost. And that's something I do want to say, is that Robert Johnson, his influence is a little bit overstated for the sheer fact that he wasn't well known up until probably the 50s or 60s, and there's a whole about decade and a half when rock and roll comes in that he wasn't around for, and he wasn't that well known. Of course, he did influence people like Muddy Waters, who was a really big influence on rock and roll music, but there's also guys like Gory Carter, like Hank Williams and all that, who probably had no idea who Robert Johnson was, who were very important for rock music. Like, I'm not sure if Chuck Berry had ever heard of Robert Johnson. It's hard to say. So, Robert Johnson has a big influence, but
I believe Chuck Berry did.
He probably...
I think he said that Robert Johnson was an influence on
That
him.
would make sense because, again, Robert Johnson definitely influenced big stars, again, like Chuck Berry and other people, but there's other artists that didn't know about him.
Mm-hmm.
But once you get to like the 60s, then everyone's kind of heard about him. So he influences kind of the second wave of rock and roll almost more than he influences the first wave. Because guys like Keith Richards, for example, he met up one time with Brian Jones, who was the original leader of the Rolling Stones, and they were listening to records together at Brian Jones' apartment. And Keith Richards listening to the record being played. He's like, "Who is this?" And Brian responds that, "Oh, it's Robert Johnson." He's like, "Yeah, but who's the guy playing with him?" And he eventually realized that it was one guy playing guitar, not two guys playing two guitars. And he said he got shivers because he realized that Robert Johnson was that good, that he could play guitar so well it sounded like two people playing.
He's almost too good.
He's almost too good. And of course now people will say like, "Oh, it's the devil playing with him," and other kind of silly things like that. But, you know, they're fun to say, but probably I don't think we have any audio recordings of the devil playing guitar out there, at least that I'm aware of. That's probably just how good Robert Johnson was and his also very unique style of playing guitar, which again, he learned in the graveyard. So there is that spooky connection there. You can't escape that. His life was almost more interesting and stranger than his actual legend was. Just a bizarre man, but very interesting. Also influenced Eric Clapton and a bunch of other very, very big musicians to where even if you can't name a song by the Rolling Stones or by Clapton, you've heard one before. So you've definitely heard Keith Richards' guitar somewhere. That's directly influenced by Robert Johnson. So there are songs you know of that are inspired by him, and that's how big he is.
Yeah, one of the sources I went to as I was doing research for this episode stated that Robert Johnson was probably one of the most significant black musicians of the 20th century, but I think it's super easy to argue that he is one of, if not the most influential musicians, full stop, of the 20th century.
For sure. He's definitely up there. I mean, the only arguments I could see would be guys like Elvis or other people that were just so big and such big superstars they've influenced literally every genre. Whereas Robert Johnson is definitely like, if you're a musician, like, and you really want to dig into the roots of like American music, you know about him, but there are still people who I'm sure have made like very popular music who don't know about him.
I would say he's influential in a different way than Elvis was. Elvis was very overtly, explicitly influential, whereas Robert Johnson was just always there, even if you didn't know about it. Yeah,
he was always kind of bubbling under. So again, it gets a little bit subjective, but he is very, very important. But I also want to make sure that I didn't just talk about only him, because there's guys like Petey Wheatstraw and all these other people that definitely influence blues and make it what it is and influence Johnson himself. That's the problem with music sometimes, that you get so fixated on one artist or one band that you forget everyone else who influenced them or was very important beforehand. So I just want to make sure we didn't talk about just him. And I'm not trying to downplay Johnson's influence. He was huge, and he was a very, very good blues man. But he wasn't the only guy to do it. And he was actually a little bit late to the party when it comes to blues. It's just that everything after him gets kind of, influenced by him. And that's what makes him very important.
Yeah, I think it's important to point out that no, Robert Johnson didn't invent the blues.
No.
He was one of the later blues musicians.
And he did not have a long career. Because, again, other guys were playing music up until, Muddy Waters was around till the 80s, I think. And he started probably right around when Johnson was around. So, again, it depends on who you talk to for who's more influential, but he has his story, and he's definitely well known, and you can find his music out there. There's Robert Johnson, The Complete Recordings, which has all of his songs ever recorded on one CD. I remember that's actually part of a big reason why his legend has gotten so much bigger over the years, because that was released in 1990 and ended up selling over 1 million copies, I think, in the U.S. alone. So he's definitely gotten a big career resurgence long after his death.
Mm-hmm. So. And I think his story is a very interesting case study in how folk legends develop.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a big part of musical lore as well. Again, if that story about him selling his soul hadn't become so popular, I don't know if we'd be sitting here talking about Robert Johnson. I think he would be much more obscure. But there's something too fun and too fascinating, too mysterious, and too kind of spooky to ignore. You have to hear about it. It gets in your head.
I mean, maybe. What if?
Again, he did learn in a graveyard. I know I keep going back to this, but that's just so bizarre to me that he learned how to play guitar at a graveyard, which is weird enough as is.
Doesn't help his reputation.
No, well, I mean, I'm not saying he sold the soul thing. Apparently, there are some versions of the story where he begged God to save him on his deathbed. In fact, we have multiple gravestones for Robert Johnson, too. He is definitively buried at one of them, and I believe it's the one that has a message that was written by him on a piece of paper that was kept by his family, and asks for like Jesus to save him.
I've heard that's disputed though, whether or
Yeah.
not he actually wrote that.
Yeah, I know it is, but if he did that, that's also been part of the legend too, is that he was on his deathbed like begging for God to save him from the devil, which would
He made a big mistake.
definitely raises a few eyebrows if you're doing that. It's like, well, Robert, what did you do before you died here? So again, it all goes back to the legend. You can't separate his life from the legend because the legend ended up becoming part of his life.
And his life almost certainly influenced the legend as well.
I mean, it did. Without Robert Johnson, there's no legend of Robert Johnson. So he's out there. Darian's cat is now trying to mess with my computer here. She hopped up on my lap earlier. Didn't he have one song called Up Jump the Devil or something like that?
I believe so.
So that's fitting that this little orange monster has jumped on my lap during the recording. So if you've heard any meowing, that's just our little blues cat here. And otherwise, we will catch you next time for the history of rock and roll and heavy metal and what makes them so spiritually inclined. Thank you again for listening, folks.
Bye.